just started. We normally start 5 minutes ago, but we're a little delayed tonight, people coming in later. And I'm not going to make any long-winded introduction for our guest. Most of you people know Jane Goodspeed. And I don't want to give away anything that she's going to be doing. So therefore, at this time, I think I would simply like to introduce to you Jane Goodspeed, who is going to give you a real treat talking about and acting out the part of Marcet Haldeman Julius, the niece of Jane Addams.
That's a long ways from here. So I took the train and we went into Chicago, and Mary came out to get me. Now you know who Mary is, don't you? Mary Fry has been at the homestead for many, many years, and we couldn't get along there without her. She is the most wonderful person. She had dinner ready for us. She had the homestead all cleaned up, just the way I love to see it. Of course, I can remember the days when grandmother was there too, and she would come out to greet us along with Mary. And I think grandmother really kind of wished that Mary and I could be sisters, although she's a little older than I am. Well, as you know, I've always enjoyed the stage. That's where I love to hear the applause that you all gave me today. And I do have a picture. I brought quite a few pictures with me. I have a picture of the way I used to look on the stage. I was a little younger then, and I certainly had a handsome man to be with me when I was out there acting. Don't you think he looks good? I do. Yes, and I traveled around with a suitcase like this, and we went to many big cities. I was with Cecil B. DeMille, and we would go from one city to another. And here's one of the kind of costumes that I used to wear. I'm not going to put it on for you, but I will show you what it looked like, because it was really beautiful. And he knew the best way to have beautiful gowns for people to wear. Well, let's see. Oh, yes. This one, beads on it. Look at this. Oh, this is the kind of thing that I wore. Of course, I wore a little something underneath it. And I had my hair beautifully done as well. But this was the kind of thing that I always loved. I've always loved storytelling. I've always loved, well, being in front of people. Now, tonight you asked me to tell you my story that I wrote when I was a young woman. And it's called Once Upon a Time. And I want to tell you about that, but I have to give you a little bit of background so you will understand where I got all these ideas from my book. First of all, you have to go way back when my mother and father were married, because that in itself is a love story that you could almost put on the stage, because they were stepbrother and stepsister. Because my grandfather had 5 children, and my grandmother had 2. And when they were married, my goodness, what a household that was. So they all were friends, and as they grew up, my mother and my father fell in love. They were married, and my father was a doctor, so he took a position clear out in Kansas. And mother was with him, of course. And of course they had all this connection back in Cedarville, and they couldn't wait to bring me back here. And so we came almost every summer, and we stayed for quite a while. So that's what I'm going to do again, stay just as long as I can, at least to tell you about this. Maybe a little bit longer if Mary will have me around. Well, anyway, there we were in Kansas, and I would come to visit. Now, my father, as I say, was a doctor, and wasn't too well as life went on. And he went into the banking business. He died, oh my goodness, it was the early 1900s, about 1905. And Mother kept the banking going for another 10 years. And then when I got into the business, it was after my mother had passed away. And I really didn't want to go back to Kansas. I'd a lot rather have been on the stage doing all these exciting things with an exciting leading man. But the good thing was, when I got back to Girard, Kansas, there was Emanuel Julius, who was running a publishing company at that time. Now, Emanuel had some pretty far out, I suppose is the word we might use sometimes today, but he had ideas that were socialistic. And I kind of like those ideas as well. I felt like our government should be spreading the wealth around to everybody. So I was quite enamored of not only Emanuel himself, but of Emanuel's ideas. And he was certainly influential in what kind of people I was talking to and the kind of stories that I was reading, and even some of the things I was writing. Well, like I say, I kept coming back to Cedarville, and when I would come as a young girl, and up into the time I was married, this is what the house kind of looked like in those days. There was a road that went down across in front of the house, and it went down to the creek where there was the mill that my grandfather had had. And if the water was there and you would ford the creek in your carriage or whatever you were in, and go up the road, and that road went on up to Wisconsin. Here's a picture that shows what my grandmother looked like as she was older. She's standing in front of that house by one of the pretty trees out in front. She was a wonderful lady. She could tell stories. She could sing. She would read to us from Shakespeare and Dickens, and she gave us a very good background. She did the same thing with my grandparents. I mean, my parents. She was my grandmother, of course. Her name was Anna, too, just like my name is. Now, if you went out the front door and across her yard and down to the creek, that's where the mill was. And this is the race, the mill dam, where the race had been going through until it finally washed out one year. But when I was a child, there was still evidence of that, and you could tell it was like a waterfall that went down. It was quite magical to look at that and think about what might be in that water. Here's another picture after you go across the creek, because there are tiny flowers and tiny leaves, old jewelweed and jack-in-the-pulpit, and in the springtime there'll be mayflowers and ferns, and everything is so wild you can just imagine elves and fairies and wonderful things living among all of this on the other side of the creek. This man here was my uncle who lived over in Mount Carroll. And he was a man who knew a lot about the plants and the animals and the things that were down there in that rocky grove by the creek. Now, if you walked back along the walls of the creek, beyond the creek, in the rocky glen, it's kind of hard to see it here, but it was very dark, and it became rock all the way along the cliff edge. And as you walked toward one end of it, you could walk into a cave. What do you suppose might be going on in there? As little children, we never knew. And we always could make up things that might have happened in there. As we looked out of that same cave, you could see out where the bright lights were. And it was exciting to know that you'd finally gotten back out to the entrance, and you knew you were pretty safe by then. And along the cave rocky wall, next to the cave, were holes where little critters lived, little birds, and sometimes bats, and maybe some other things could live in there as well. You never know. Now, next to that rock, there is a place where some of the rock was taken out. It was a little quarry, and I believe some of it could have been used to build some of the things at the homestead, but also down at the bottom of a hill, near there was an old sheep shed. And on the top of that hill were so many pine trees you could hardly see underneath them. It was practically dark. And of course, everybody called the place Pine Hill because there were so many pine trees up there. The children liked to play up there, and of course, as you walked along the cliff, you tried to dare yourself to go all the way up there and walk along and look down at the water. So these are the pine trees that were up there. They were planted by my grandfather many, many years ago, and by the time I was a little girl, they were tall. They were as tall as these trees. Just as straight, some of them, as a telephone pole or the nest on a ship. They were that tall and that amazing to a little girl. Now, if you went across the creek, as I say, and you saw all these things, you could also go up that road after you went over the creek and up just a little ways, and there was another lane that went on beyond the creek, and at the top of that lane and up through the trees, there was a lovely big house up there where my uncle lived. His name was John Weber Adams. He wasn't too well, so don't really remember a whole lot about him. But the house was big, it had a big front, big porch around it, and it had lovely, lovely things inside. My Aunt Laura was almost always there, and my cousin Sarah, whom I loved to play with, we would go down there to the creek and imagine all sorts of things. We'd go in the cave, and we'd walk along the top and up where the pine trees were. But this was the house where she lived at Cedar Cliff. Inside the house, you can see, this is my Aunt Laura. You can see all the beautiful things that were in that house. She had vases and paintings and other things that were quite magical looking to me. But the best thing she had was a doorway that had a curtain in it. You can barely see it in the picture. It had beautiful iridescent stones in that beaded curtain. And at the top of the curtain, you could just make out a peacock. Below the peacock, a swan. Can't see that too well in the picture. But those things were up there in that house. Well, as I went on through my life and I began thinking about all of these things that were so important to me as a child, my Aunt Jane, you remember from Hull House, Aunt Jane? That Aunt Jane encouraged me to write down some of the stories, some of the fairy tales that my grandmother had told me. So I did that very thing, and I wrote a book that I have right here to show you, and it's called Once Upon a Time. And this story has a lot of the things in it that I remember as a child. And this is a story that Mr. Dave asked me to share with you tonight. I'm not going to read it, I'm going to tell you the story, but I do want to read you the way the story begins. The way to Fairyland lies through the village where the cedars grow. Now, you know where that is, don't you? It is a really, truly village, and at the very end of it, you will find a place where the birds like to nest. This is on the borderland of the Enchanted Valley, and you will know it at once by the bits of string hung on the bushes for the birds to use in building, or better still, by the many tanagers and orioles and woodpeckers. Soon, a beautiful lady in a wonderful trailing robe of shimmering lavender will come out of her house. So I think we better find that beautiful robe. And here it is. This beautiful robe that once belonged to my grandmother. Jane Addams gave it to her, and I want to put it on because I think it'll make her story even better. I always like to dress up when I'm telling my stories because, as you know, being on stage is one of my favorite things. Come here. Look, I want you to sit. Isn't that lovely? Well, let's go back to our story now. The beautiful lady in the trailing robe of shimmering lavender will come out of the house and in the midst of the trees and begin to feed the birds. Be careful, don't interrupt her, but wait patiently until they have all